It was 11:45 at night, and I was covered in mahogany dust, sanding a joint my father claimed was too difficult to save. That is when I saw it. A crumpled piece of paper in the waste bin I was emptying. It wasn't trash. It was a deed of transfer, signed, notarized, and dated 3 years ago. My parents had secretly gifted the entire business, oak and iron, to my brother, Adrian. I stood there, holding 15 years of my sweat equity in one hand and their betrayal in the other. I didn't scream. I just realized I hadn't been building a legacy. I'd been working for free. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Since we have just entered 2026, I want to wish you all a powerful and prosperous new year. How do you wish each other a happy new year in your country? Let me know down below. And if you value this content, please support the channel so we can keep bringing these stories to you. To understand why I didn't set the building on fire right then and there, you have to understand the architecture of my family. My brother, Adrian, had a Master of Business Administration and hands as soft as damp clay. He spoke in buzzwords. He talked about synergy and scaling and pivoting. He wore Italian loafers to a workshop that smelled of sawdust and solvent. I, on the other hand, had hands that looked like a topographical map of every mistake I had ever made and fixed. I had chemical burns from stripping Victorian varnish and calluses thick enough to strike a match on. For 15 years, I was the one who arrived at 5 in the morning to warm up the glue pots. I was the one who could identify the difference between red oak and white oak by smell alone. My father, Samuel, was the founder, the face on the brochure. My mother, Cynthia, handled the books and the social climbing, but I was the one who actually did the work. I was the one restoring the Heritage Library shelves for the $3.6 million contract we had just landed. But in my family, competence was a cloak of invisibility. There is a psychological concept called the glass child. Usually, it refers to a sibling of someone who is sick or disabled, the healthy child who is looked through because they demand nothing. But in business families, there is a variation of this, the invisible workhorse. I was the load-bearing wall. I was solid. I held up the roof. I never cracked. I never complained. And I never needed maintenance. Because I was essential, I became part of the infrastructure, unnoticed and unthanked. Adrian, however, was the chandelier. He was fragile, expensive, and the first thing my parents showed off to guests. He was shiny. He needed constant polishing and attention. My parents spent their energy managing his ego and funding his failed crypto investments, assuming I would always be there to pay the electric bill. They looked right through me because they knew I wouldn't move. They mistook my reliability for a lack of ambition. Finding that paper changed the physics of our relationship instantly. I realized that keeping the secret for 3 years wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. They knew Adrian couldn't run the joinery. He didn't know a chisel from a screwdriver. If they had told me the truth 3 years ago that the business was his and I was just the help, I would have left. And if I left, the profits would stop. So, they let me believe I was earning my inheritance. They let me work 80-hour weeks, thinking I was investing in my own future, when really, I was just fattening the calf for the golden child. I looked around the silent workshop. I saw the tools I had bought with my own money because my father said the budget was tight. I saw the prototypes I had designed late at night. I saw the life I had built on a foundation of lies. My father always said that good joinery relies on tension and pressure to hold together, but he forgot that if you apply too much pressure to the wrong point, the wood doesn't bend, it snaps. And standing there in the midnight silence, I finally snapped. I didn't storm into my parents' bedroom. I didn't wake Adrian to demand an explanation. That would have been emotional, and I was done being emotional. I waited until 2 in the morning, when the house was silent. Then, I went to work. I didn't steal a single thing that belonged to oak and iron. I only took what was mine. I packed my Lee Nielsen chisels, my Japanese pull saws, and the custom planes I had purchased with my own savings over the last decade. Next, I went to the office computer. I didn't delete the company data. I simply removed the folder labeled Haley's Custom Designs. Every CAD file, every blueprint for the Victorian restorations, every template for the high-end joinery that brought in our biggest clients, I deleted them from the server and wiped the backups. They weren't company property. They were my intellectual property, created on my own time. If Adrian was the owner, surely he could design his own templates. I placed my workshop key on the center of my father's desk. Next to it, I left a yellow sticky note with 5 words. Good luck with the sawdust. I walked out the back door and drove away. I didn't look back. The next morning, the the silence broke. My phone began to vibrate at 7:15. First, it was a text from my mother. "Client is here early. Where are you?" Then, a missed call from my father. Then, 3 more. By 8:30, the text had shifted from annoyed to frantic. "Haley, pick up. We can't find the blueprints for the library restoration. Haley, stop playing games." I didn't answer a single one. I sat in a diner on the edge of town, staring at a cup of black coffee. For the first time in 15 years, my hands were clean. There was no dust under my fingernails, but as I sat there, I felt a strange, physical ache in my palms and forearms. It was the phantom pain of a severed limb. My body was so conditioned to the rhythm of labor, the push of the plane, the resistance of the wood, that being idle felt like an injury. But as I watched my phone light up with another desperate call from Adrian, I realized that the pain wasn't from losing the work. It was the feeling of the toxic limb finally being cut off. It hurt, but the gangrene was gone. To understand why my family thought they could survive without me, you have to look back at a dinner we had 6 months ago. It was a celebration for Adrian completing his Master of Business Administration. He sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of red wine, lecturing me about the inefficiency of my methods. He used words like scaling, automation, and composite materials. He told my father that the future of the joinery wasn't in restoration, but in mass production using cheaper, imported wood and automated CNC routers. He called my work analog and quaint. My parents nodded along, entranced. They looked at him with a reverence they had never shown me. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a psychological phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Because my parents didn't actually know how to do the high-end joinery themselves, they only managed the business side. They lacked the competence to evaluate Adrian's incompetence. To them, his confidence looked like expertise. They mistook his buzzwords for strategy. They thought that because he knew how to make a spreadsheet look pretty, he knew how to make wood bend without breaking. They truly believed that the craft was the easy part and that the management was the real work. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson in reality. Back in the present, the tone of the messages on my phone shifted. The frantic requests for blueprints stopped, replaced by the familiar rhythm of gaslighting. My mother sent a long text. "You are hurting the family. This is incredibly selfish. Your father is stressed, and it is affecting his heart." Then came Adrian. "Stop being a drama queen. We don't need your little tools. We are pivoting to a new supplier anyway. Just send the passwords for the client database, or I will sue you for theft." I stared at the screen. Theft. He was accusing me of stealing intellectual property that lived in my head. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I blocked their numbers, one by one. I didn't feel guilty about my father's stress. Stress is a byproduct of poor management, and he had just appointed a manager who thought pine was a hardwood. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and walked out into the cold morning air. I was unemployed, homeless in a professional sense, and completely alone. But I wasn't afraid. I knew something they didn't. I knew that wood doesn't lie, and neither does the market. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. Then, my personal cell phone rang. It wasn't my family. It was Richard, the lead architect for the Heritage Library project. He was the man holding the keys to the $3.6 million contract that was supposed to fund Adrian's new era. I answered on the second ring. "Haley," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "I am standing in the workshop. Your brother just tried to explain to me why we should use a chemical stain on 200-year-old oak instead of the traditional beeswax finish you specified. He called it cost-efficient." I walked out. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "I'm sorry, Richard. I don't work there anymore." "I gathered that," he replied. "I didn't hire a building, Haley. I didn't hire a logo. I hired you. You are the only one in this state who knows how to restore those shelves without destroying them. If you aren't there, the contract is void. I don't have a shop, Richard. I don't have the space to take on a project that size." "Find one," he said. "I will give you an advance on the materials. But I need to know right now, are you a woodworker or were you just an employee?" It was a challenge. It was a lifeline. I drove to the edge of town, to an old, drafty barn I had driven past 1,000 times. It had a dirt floor in sections and the wind whistled through the siding, but it was dry, and it was empty. I called the owner and leased it on the spot with the last of my savings. I spent the next 3 days leveling the floor and wiring up a generator. It was freezing. My breath fogged in the air as I set up my workbench. But when I made that first cut into a piece of fresh timber, the sound was different. It wasn't the sound of labor, it was the sound of ownership. Building a business from scratch involves a mountain of paperwork that has nothing to do with wood. I spent my evenings filing liability insurance, registering my limited liability company, and ensuring my vendor contracts were airtight. I asked a friend from high school, who now works in commercial real estate law, to run a standard title check on my new barn lease, just to be safe. 2 days later, she called me. She didn't want to talk about my barn. She wanted to talk about oak and iron. "Haley," she said, her voice dropping to that professional whisper people use when delivering bad news. "I ran a conflict check against your old employer to make sure there were no non-compete clauses attached to the land title. I found something you need to see." I drove to her office, expecting a zoning issue or a forgotten permit. What she slid across the desk was a foreclosure notice in the making. It turned out the ownership transfer 3 years ago wasn't the only secret my family had kept. 6 months ago, while I was sanding floors and managing the shop's cash flow to keep us in the black, Adrian had convinced my parents to leverage the commercial property, the land, the building, my grandfather's legacy as collateral for a massive, high-interest business loan. The documents showed the funds were wire transferred to a tech growth fund that I recognized immediately from the news. It was a cryptocurrency exchange that had imploded last month. The money was gone, vaporized, but the debt remained. The asset my parents thought they were protecting for their golden child was actually a ticking time bomb. Oak and Iron was technically insolvent. They didn't just have a new, incompetent owner. They had a mortgage they couldn't service without the revenue from the contracts I had just taken with me. I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at the photocopy of the lien. I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If I had stayed, if I had accepted their generous offer to be a manager later, I would have spent the next 20 years working to pay off my brother's gambling debt. I would have been the engine on a sinking ship, shoveling coal while they steered us into an iceberg. For the first time, the anger completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, terrifying relief. I hadn't just walked away from a job. I had escaped a burning building moments before the roof collapsed. Winter settled hard over the valley. My barn wasn't insulated properly yet, so I worked in a heavy wool coat, my breath misting in the air as I shaped the cornices for Richard's library. The cold kept me sharp. The silence kept me focused. Then, the inevitable happened. The sound of a car crunching over the frozen gravel of my driveway broke the rhythm. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. My father, Samuel, stood in the doorway of the barn. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His shoulders, usually squared with the pride of the patriarch, were slumped. He didn't look at me. He looked at the work on my bench, the flawless dovetails, the grain matched perfectly. He recognized the quality. It was the quality that used to pay his bills. "We missed the deadline for the Johnson account," he said, his voice raspy. "The bank is calling every day, Haley. Adrian is overwhelmed." I continued planing a piece of walnut, the shaving curling up like a ribbon. "I am sorry to hear that," I said, my voice steady. "We need you back," he said, stepping fully into the room. "Your mother is sick with worry. We are willing to make a deal. You come back as shop manager. We will give you 10% equity." 10%, Haley. That is generous. I stopped working. I set the plane down. I turned to face him. The audacity was breathtaking. They were offering me 10% of a crater. They wanted me to come back and use my labor to pay off the loan that had destroyed the business, all while reporting to the brother who signed the papers. "I know about the loan, Dad," I said. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I know Adrian leveraged the land," I continued, my voice calm. "Factual, lethal. I know the money is gone. I know the shop is worthless. We can save it," he pleaded, desperation cracking his voice. "With your hands, with your speed, we can work our way out of it. It's your heritage, Haley." In that moment, I felt the final stitch of the surgical removal. The guilt, the obligation, the desperate need for his approval, it all fell away. I realized that saving them would mean destroying myself. It would mean infecting my new life with their gangrene. "I am not the heir, Dad," I said, picking up my chisel. "I never was. And I am not your savior." I looked him dead in the eye. "I am the competition, and I am winning." He stood there for a long moment, a ghost in a graveyard of his own making. Then he turned and walked out into the cold. I didn't watch him go. I went back to the wood. 6 weeks later, Oak and Iron Heritage Joinery went to auction. I didn't go to watch the foreclosure. I didn't go to gloat. I went for one reason only. I stood in the back of the cold, echoing warehouse as the auctioneer sold off the industrial saws, the dust collection systems, and the fleet of delivery trucks. Strangers bought the infrastructure of my childhood for pennies on the dollar. I saw my parents standing near the exit, huddled in their coats, arguing quietly with Adrian. They looked small. They looked like people who had gambled their legacy on a buzzing sound and lost. When Lot 42 came up, I raised my paddle. It was a heavy, scarred workbench made of solid maple. It was covered in burns and gouges. It wasn't worth much to anyone else. It was too old, too analog. But it was the bench my grandfather had built by hand. It was the bench where I had learned to cut my first dovetail. I bought it for $300. I arranged for it to be delivered to my barn the next morning. I walked out of the auction house without speaking to my family. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need their acknowledgement. The closure wasn't in their words. It was in my actions. Today, my barn isn't cold anymore. I installed radiant heating last month. I have a team now, 3 apprentices, who know that the quality of the joint matters more than the speed of the cut. I teach them what my grandfather taught me. Respect the material, and it will hold you up. The workbench sits in the center of the shop, a constant reminder that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, day by day, with your own 2 hands. I am not the heir of a name. I am the heir of the sawdust, the sweat, and the silence of good work. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I am worth. If you've ever had to walk away to find your worth, or if you're the one holding everything together while others get the credit, share your story below. You aren't alone.